Hello, everyone. This is Mia Dan. I'm the CEO of Lighthouse 3. I'm also on the board of the United Nations Association of USA, San Francisco chapter. Welcome all. I'm glad you were able to join us, even if not in person, virtually. Today, we have a great event planned for you. We have a fantastic panel discussion with some amazing women. But before I introduce my panelists, I'd like to first start off with a big thank you for folks who have helped make this event happen. One is Jasmine Gota, who is my co-organizer, fellow board member, who has been very instrumental helping us put this event together. I'd also like to give a big shout out and thank you to all my fellow board members, Elsia, Fyodor, Kira Burrell. I just want to make sure that I'm not forgetting anyone. Swagata, Jimmy, Lena Lenberg, all these folks have helped make this event so successful. Also, a big shout out to our volunteers, Mao, Tatiana, as well as Maya. Thank you so much for helping us today, both offline as well as virtually. So before I introduce my amazing panel, I'd like to introduce our fearless leader, Mary Steiner, who is the president of UNA USA San Francisco chapter. So I'd love for her to first kick off the event, share with us the mission of the UNASF and also the great partnership with our sponsor for today, who is the Canadian Consulate of San Francisco and also Women's Tech Maker as organization at Google. So that's it. Mary, over to you.
Yes, welcome everybody. Hello to everybody. And I think we have some new friends joining us today. And we especially want to thank you for reaching out to us and joining us. This is a very important day. The United Nations Association San Francisco has a mission to achieve the goals of the United Nations to support the human rights and the sustainable development goals and to support above all the charter. And as you know, it is 25 years since the convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. And San Francisco has played a very important role and the chapter is part of 200 chapters across the nation. I think Albuquerque and Houston may be joining us. Hello, everybody. And we have a women's committee. We also consult with the UN Status of Women Commission. So we're linked up globally as well as locally to our community groups here in the San Francisco Bay Area. As you know, the city and county of San Francisco was the first city to adopt portions of CEDAW, the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That was in 1998. So the Status of Women Department has been very prominent in helping other cities to adopt CEDAW. We're thrilled to have the partnership, the sponsorship of the Consulate General of Canada. We have with us today Kate Walter, who is the Senior Foreign Policy Officer with the consulate. And it's because of her leadership and Yves Below that we have sponsored other programs equally important. World Environment Day is one on June 5th that we've held 2 times in the past. And then Women's Day, International Women's Day. This is our 2nd partnership. So I'd like Kate to comment because she is very involved with international foreign affairs and women. Hello, Kate.
Hi, Mary. Thank you. So I would also like to add my welcome on behalf of the Canadian Consulate here in San Francisco and our Consul General, Rana Sarkar, who unfortunately could not be here this afternoon. I would just like to speak a little bit about why Canada is sponsoring this event and similar events around the world today and throughout the year, really. For the past 3 years or so, the government of Canada has made gender equality and women's empowerment a cornerstone of its domestic and its foreign policy. Canada has adopted what they call a feminist foreign policy, and they're using that to advance objectives of strengthening rule-based international order and to uphold progressive values in Canada and around the world. So in San Francisco, we support these policy goals, and then we also add a layer of tech to everything we do here, as you might imagine. Our office focuses much of our work on tech policy and what's called techplomacy, if you haven't heard that term yet. So many of the issues that I'm sure our panelists will address this afternoon are very important to our work and to the reports that we send back to Canada to inform Canada's policies as well. I'll keep it short. So with that, I'm going to say thank you again to everyone who has joined us this afternoon, and I will hand back the mic, so to speak. Thank you.
And Mia?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Mary, and thank you so much, Kate, again, for your generous sponsorship. I would like to kick off our panel discussion for today with just saying Happy International Women's Day. And what better way to celebrate the special day than to discuss what it means for women's rights in the age of AI and tech. Being that we are so close to Silicon Valley, we have invited 3 very prominent women in this industry who are doing a great job promoting the vision and the mission of women in tech, women in AI, and just promoting diversity. So I will start off with a quick introduction. The flow is as follows. We will first start off with a panel discussion, and I will ask a few questions of our panelists. And then we will have about an hour for the discussion, and then we will have about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. So we'll take questions from the audience, and you can use the Q&A feature to add your questions. And I'll try and ask as many as I can, but given the limited amount of time that we have, we may have to cut back on some, but we'll see how it goes. But also know that this event is being recorded, and we will make sure you have a link to this event to share with others, and also have it for yourself later after this event. So that said, I will get started. So let me start off with Lily Ganges, who is an amazing diversity champion. She's a Latina in tech. She's a Chief Technology Community Officer at Kapoor Center right here in Oakland. She's also the head of tech talent and entrepreneurship ecosystem. She's an influential leader for diversity, especially representation of Latinas in technology. Our next panelist is Jill Finlayson, who is the Director of Women in Tech Initiative at UC, who just hosted a fantastic symposium just yesterday. So she's definitely a huge advocate for women in the space, and also will share her insights onto how we can continue to make progress on women's rights. Last but not the least, we have Karen Silverman, and who's a partner at Latham and Watkins in San Francisco. She's a member of the AI Global Council at the World Economic Forum. She's also a top 10 legal innovator in North America for 2019. So super impressive panel. So what I would love to do is give you all a few minutes to just describe your journey. How did you get started in the role that you are in currently? So I will let you decide who wants to go first. Jill, Lily, Karen, please.
Sure, I can start. I'm so excited to be here as well. Thank you so much for organizing this event and for also bringing it in online. And hopefully folks will be able to also visit this recording and continue to share the message. So thank you for that, and thank you to all the panelists here. For my journey, so my journey specifically in tech, it's an immigrant story. The same stats that you could hear, right? I immigrated from Bolivia when I was like 6 years old, single parent home. Went into one of the LAUSD districts out in LA that didn't have the right funding or scoring and whatnot. But yet I persevered through all of those stats and just really fell in love with math. Math was my universal language. And so I went on into a career in electrical engineering and then software engineering. For about 6 years, I was in the aerospace industry working on systems of aerospace, things that were just really amazing, classified information. From an engineering perspective, I was totally geeking out and nerding out on the types of things I was I was learning about. But at the same time, there was a specific project as I got to learn more about the geopolitics and how these systems were being used and how they could be used. I really had to face a big decision for myself, and I decided to leave this industry and look for something that is more aligned to what I wanted to do, which is helping close gaps of access using technology and using technology as a way to help increase education, finance opportunities, improve healthcare. And so I left an awesome career as an engineer, but I really wanted to see the rest of the world and see what are other opportunities where I can use my talent, my perspectives to really tackle some of the more urgent needs in the community. And I think a lot of that was really influenced by my own journey. As I shared earlier, having my own obstacles to overcome, whether as being not just being the only woman in some of these technical rooms, but sometimes being the only person of color, and definitely being a lot of times the only Latina, and also being the youngest person. And so I think that was really a lot of different areas of my life that it's taken me a lot of time to unpack. And I think that the work that I do now at the Caper Center has really allowed me to have the research, the data, the dialogue, the words to express what are some of those types of biases and systems of inequalities that I had been working under. And so how can we actually create new systems, and how can we leverage the technology, the policy, the talent, and really the community to have a different type of dialogue going into 2020 and beyond. And so that's my journey from lived experience of being on the ground, being a developer, and just really trying to leverage this type of technology and really question, where is it that we're running to so fast? Why are we building the things that we're building, and to who? But most importantly, what are the unintended consequences that it's having, and who is it impacting the most?
That's awesome, Lily. I'm Jill Finlayson, and I'm the director of the Women in Tech Initiative, and also a big fan of Caper's work, and really appreciate you kind of sharing that shift and travel that you had. I myself also started at Berkeley. I had actually graduated from Berkeley, worked at Berkeley, but very quickly moved to the private sector and worked at startups. I was actually at eBay during the first 5 years, and then I worked at a number of startups after that. Moved into social entrepreneurship with the Skoll Foundation. And then eventually the last job I had before I came back to Berkeley was running an incubator for deep tech startups that were using exponential tech to solve global grand challenges. And along the way, I started mentoring for Tech Women. TechWomen.org is a State Department program that was started to really facilitate the women in STEM globally, but also to build diplomatic bridges, really, peer-to-peer, person-to-person diplomacy. And it's been an amazing program, but one of the best things that I learned about this was through bringing these women from the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and Pakistan to the Bay Area for mentorship with tech companies, is you learn how universal a lot of the challenges are that women face in tech. And so the things that we're experiencing in Silicon Valley are another flavor, but of the same types of issues. So when the opportunity came to return to Berkeley and have this role as the director of the Women in Tech Initiative, I jumped at it because the goal here is to increase the participation, persistence, and advancement of women in tech. And really, I look at that as just how do we address unrepresented people more broadly? And what I've come to after a year of working in this space is it really comes down to how do we make workplaces more equitable? How do we make those systemic changes? How do we get the leadership that we need to have the skills that they need to be successful in the 21st century? And if we do those things well, we'll create company cultures where women not only want to work, but will stay working.
Thank you, both Jill and Lily. This is Karen Silverman. So I come at this from an utterly different background. I've been a lawyer for the last 30 years, and a corporate lawyer at that, right? So I've worked with business. I've been in the Bay Area and sort of at the side of a lot of technology clients as they've really encountered frontier after frontier. So that's my sort of official day job background, although that's about to change. I'm also on the board of Legal Momentum, which is the Women Legal and Defense Fund, as well as for Not for Sale, which is an anti-trafficking and human rights organization. And so a personal interest in human rights and a personal interest in technology and a professional interest in how business gets done and makes decisions in uncharted waters sort of all brought me together to really start over the last couple of years focusing on, as I think Lily and Jill have both alluded to, sort of the impact of the technologies that are now so pervasive in business. And so a lot of my work lately has been how to bring, and I'm just so honored to be here under the auspices, among other things, of the UN Association, but how to bring sort of core values around human rights and human rights principles into technology decisions, but also the very day-to-day business decisions that are upon us as these technologies get ingested. So I'm actually about to transition from my corporate partner position to a small consulting and advisory group that is really just focused on supporting senior managers in business as they think through the impact and how they think through human rights, among a suite of other considerations. But in technology, and gender is a big piece of it. It's not the only piece of it, but it's one that I'm honored to be sort of a leading voice on. So much more about all of that later, but that's my background. I'm actually in transition, pivoting much more to these issues than I've ever been before, and couldn't be more excited than I am. So thanks.
And we are very excited to have you all. Thank you so much. You have such a fantastic background, and I know this is going to be a great discussion. So let me just kick off with, since you all have background, whether directly or indirectly in tech, we hear tech making a lot of headlines. It has been for a while, and it's not necessarily something positive. It's always some controversy. What's so unique about tech? What makes it so hostile to women, if you will? Like, let's just get that out of the way, right? Elephant in the room. So what is your take? What makes it so different? Why is it so hostile to women?
I can start. I think specifically women, and then also when we start to take a look at women of color, I think that there are the intersectionality varies, I think. And so I think the number one thing is to address is the systemic and structural issues that exist that are not just in the tech sector, but across, right? I think we've been starting to see a lot of more information come to bear and more data to showing the depth of some of these problems, but also the opportunity to solve them. So back in 2017, the Caper Center did a tech lever study with about 2,000 or so tech professionals of intersectional background. And the number one reason why the industry has been so welcoming is just bias and really unfair treatment. And it's a $16 billion problem. These tech companies are spending $16 billion every year to tackle all of this. And the problem is that a lot of the times we know what the issue is, but is the leadership ready to change? I think what's been interesting is just a little tidbits from that research, it indicated that over a third of the people felt a direct unfairness of mistreatment. And therefore that played a reason of why they left. And unfortunately, we are having folks not just leave companies, but actually leave sectors. And if we're losing the talent, the intersectional talent, that's even worse. And so people of color, actually underrepresented people of color, showed twice the experience of being stereotyped. And 30% of that sample of underrepresented women of color said that they were passed for promotions. And so it just varies as you go by identity. And I think that's important to address each of those pieces of identity, because as we're going into the 2050, the demographics of the US specifically is going to be so much more diverse and different. And it's actually the different intersectionalities are going to be much more critical. And so there's not one solution at all. But I do think that now there are opportunities for companies to really start to look at a very comprehensive strategies, looking at not just having trainings, but really with some of the staff members, but it starts with the leadership. To set the right culture, to set the right core of values, but also incentivizing and having effective and fair management processes throughout. I think that especially now in tech, with all these discussions over the last 10 years, steps forward, steps backwards, steps to the side, but the numbers itself hasn't drastically changed despite the number of investments. So I really do think that we have to challenge and say, are people serious about changing this problem? And it starts with leadership, as well as policy that is making sure that these changes are happening and that we're actually measuring it much more consistently, so that way we can see with a better accuracy.
That's absolutely true. And, you know, if I were to look at this and look for sort of some underlying causes, I have sort of a two-part answer to this question. And the first part starts out with, there's this false perception of meritocracy, right? Like in tech, in Silicon Valley, people are like, we work to be here, we work to be successful. But what actually is happening is a couple of things. One, it's more of a meritocracy, right? They look for people who are like them, have had similar experiences, because they think that's going to be what makes them successful. But the problem with, you know, really relying on meritocracy is that it assumes this even playing field, right? It disregards barriers, it disregards privilege, and it also ignores the value that people with different cognitive experiences bring to the table, right? And so where we look at women on boards, we often see women are underrepresented on boards, but even when we have women on boards, often they don't bring cognitive diversity, right? They've gone to the same schools, they've had the same privilege, they've had the same experience. And so what the research has shown, and I actually have a couple quotes here that I'll share because they're super interesting. Companies that explicitly held meritocracy as a core value, managers assigned greater rewards to male employees over female employees with identical performance evaluations. So explicitly adopting meritocracy as a value convinces subjects of their own moral bona fides. Satisfied that they are just, they become less inclined to examine their own behavior for signs of prejudice. And so that meritocracy itself makes people more selfish, less self-critical, and more prone to discriminatory ways. So what does that mean? So that's the first part, right? The second part is, if that's the case, then women are also less likely to get information, inside tips, the shoulder tap for opportunities. And without that, they will not advance. And if women don't advance, to the point of the KPER study, they leave, right? And so they leave at a 45% higher rate, and they actually leave because of the lack of career growth trajectory, the unfairness, and, you know, the opportunities to really advance. And so it's not even so much just getting women into tech, it's keeping them there because the culture hasn't been made in a way that everybody feels like they belong.
So this is Karen. I echo all of that and want to bring one other additional perspective to that. So in the law, we've been dealing with this and sort of gender equity for a very, very long time. And it's, you know, over the 30 years I've been in practice, there have been great strides on the one hand and enormous setbacks. So it's recruiting, it's retention, it's support, it's mentoring, sponsorship, all of it. I think tech has some very particular characteristics, right? Which is the historical focus on maths and sciences, so that so there is it's not even a pipeline issue, it's just a bias issue that starts very early on. And there's some sort of powerful studies out there that demonstrate that sort of one bad teacher or one discouraging teacher early in you know, a child's education can deter them or encourage them in various, it actually takes several instances to encourage and only one to discourage from certain fields of study. And I think that is perhaps improving, but it is, we're seeing it play out in the professional environment. I would also point out that we need to tackle the culture of the organizations themselves, but we also need to tackle the funding, because I see the capital is flowing to male founders in just vastly disproportionate quantities and at a velocity that's very, very different than the women founders are experiencing. And even with the last 15 years of sort of specific focus on getting money to women founders, right? So so we need to think about the mechanisms, and we need to think about the culture, and we need to think, I think, about the history and sort of progeny of the people we're bringing into the workforce, and what expectations and biases and reinforcements they've experienced over the lengths of their career. So anyway, it's a tricky subject, but I think this access to capital and money is something it's fairly specific to this startup technology world, because it's just so disproportionate.
Agreed. Great points all around. And there is this, there are two sides to the equation. There's demand and the supply. On the demand side, it sounds like the businesses and the startups, they just have this culture. The culture needs to change, and the leadership needs to have the mindset where it's welcoming and it's not it considers the challenges that women, minorities face. So that's one part of the equation, like the startup. But on the other hand, how do you feel about, is this a supply issue? Like, do we have qualified folks out there, women who are not being considered? Like, how are we building that pipeline? Or is that just a myth? There are plenty of women. I have my own opinion, but I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. So does somebody want to go first?
I think that the talent is there. Really, and this is the part where I think technology could be a good tool, but also we have to be very mindful. And this is where the AI aspect of the data that we're working with is really important to make sure that we're not creating even more bias. But I would say that the talent is there. Every day in my work at Caper Center, we work on identifying amazing talent. And what the missing part is, on the other side of the companies, actually trying new ways to engage the talent. There's right now, as there's data that shows when you specifically are looking for talent with specific criteria from the same 4 or 5 schools and with the structural systems, of course you're not going to run into more than 100 or whatever the numbers may be. The reality is that there's still, based on the number of degrees that are even achieved in engineering of people of color specifically, those are still not being at the same levels of the representative of the workforce in itself. So there's still even more within the folks that have already graduated and are looking for jobs. It's really how are these companies sourcing the talent? And when you have folks who are incentivized, or you contract out how you look for talent and you're incentivizing those people searching for talent, they're not gonna spend the time to go, for example, to the local community college where there's so much talent there that is just waiting to be tapped for internships, even apprenticeships. I think that being able to take a look at new models of being able to assess, upskill, but then also be able to provide new pathways into the jobs, because some of these jobs are also being created as we speak, right? There's careers that we never thought were going to be careers now that are full-fledged and are 6 figures and important jobs within some of these tech companies, such as the social media and even more data analysis and DevOps. But we are just, I think that it's an issue where, to be honest, some people are just point out lazy. They got to really rethink of what schools are they recruiting from, what talent pools, what are they looking in their criteria. Removing actually degree requirements would open up so much more. But technology could also help us take a look at how the resumes are being reviewed, and if they're automated and if they're looking for keywords, you're not going to see the entire talent. We also have job descriptions, and the wording that they use may actually deter people from applying. There's folks who always feel like, even in my own personal experience, right? You're applying for a job, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have all 5 points. Should I apply or not? And then there's somebody else across the valley that's like, oh, I made 1 point, 2 points. I'm just going to see what happens. And so I think it's both sides that we have to make sure that on the workforce side that they're trying different ways and really assessing talent in new ways, and being very specific about removing some of the bias, trying new and different strategies. I mean, meeting the community where they're at. On the talent side, we also want to make sure that we are putting ourselves out there and applying for those opportunities and being able to really take advantage of that. And I think that the great rise of different organizations like women tech makers is important. So then that way we have that support group and we can see ourselves in those roles, and encourage each other and do the referrals that I think is also really important. And just to give you a little bit of some numbers, specifically this rise in tech and startups trying to tackle, the people ops and technology, to help innovate the HR sector, it's about $140 billion market opportunity. So people know, and it's not just the talent. There's just new ways that we have to be assessing, because the current ways just aren't showing their results.
Karen, why don't you take this next and then I'll recap.
Fair enough. I mean, I do think there are definitely supply and pipeline issues, but and I think, Lily, you put your finger on it. We need to take deliberate steps to broaden the lens and to look for ways that people with diverse backgrounds, defined however you want to define that, but look for ways to bring them into organizations and find places where their value, where we can sort of elicit the value and apply the value in really practical ways. I think I'm a little wary also of some of these AI solutions to AI problems. Where the people who are building and instructing these tools largely are less diverse than the general population. And I see the literalness of some of these tools, not just creating bias and perpetuating bias, but also then sort of creating that the illusion or the presumption that the science is somehow correct, or that the outcomes are somehow correct, and so they take on weight and significance that they really don't deserve yet, and we need to be on guard about. So I see the tools both in terms of how they're being developed being a part of this pipeline problem, but also how they're applied as being part of the pipeline problem. And when you start to surface this with businesses who are beginning to think about how to use these tools, they're actually pretty alert. I mean, they're not necessarily alert when you start the conversation, but they're concerned when you get into the conversation about how they can then responsibly use them to if not, some of them are interested in improving the situations they've got at work, but many of them are very interested in not making it worse. And so you lay that on top of these pipeline questions, and I think it's a whole new world, and this is a really important conversation for us to be having. I mean, it's going to have to be an explicit conversation. It can't just be a group of people within an organization concerned about diversity. This has got to permeate every function of business or organization.
Absolutely.
So I'm not sure that answers the pipeline question, but I see it as a kind of glass on the beach problem right now.
So I want to sort of encapsulate all of that into 3 words: retention, intention, and selection. If we want to address the pipeline question, the first thing we have to say is, are you retaining the people that you currently have in the company? Because if women are going into the company and they're leaving, which we know they're leaving at a much higher rate than men are, 45% more likely to leave, if you can't retain the talent, the pipeline just doesn't matter. Because you're going to have them come in, the turnover, you're not going to have the role models or the culture that will attract the next generation. So if you aren't specifically making your workplace an environment where women can succeed, where people of color can succeed, where people of gender fluidity can succeed, you're not going to solve the problem by looking at the pipeline. So that's the first thing, retention. Second thing is intention. And you guys have kind of addressed this, especially from the perspective of how do you intently and purposefully make your recruiting more inclusive, right? This is the systemic part. So the other one is more culture, leadership side. Intention is systemic. How do you make your job descriptions, to your point about the requirements? Eliminate not bad requirements. Make sure you get rid of gendered language. Make sure that you're actually recruiting where people are, and you're making an intentional effort to do that. And so all the way through the recruiting and selection process, are you asking structured interview questions? Are you being fair? Because if you're not, again, the pipeline doesn't matter, because they're not going to make it through the interview process. And then the third part, and this is the part I'm actually still trying to figure out, so my colleagues on the panel maybe jump in and help me out with this, but selection. I don't think we're selecting for the right criteria. And there's sort of several areas in this. And one is, are we looking for 21st century leadership skills? Things that you can create psychological security in teams, you value diverse perspectives, you have excellent communication and collaboration skills. Those are the things we should be selecting for. Those are the things that make successful employees. But in reality, we're asking how many years of Java do you have, right? And that's not going to help us select the best people for the job. And then very specifically, let's say we have 2 candidates that are the same skill level in Java. Who are we going to hire? Well, let's ask better questions. Let's ask, what kind of blind spot can you prevent us from having? What perspective are you going to bring to the innovation team that isn't currently there? What markets do you have access or understanding to? What networks do you have? What are you going to bring that's going to add to our team and make our innovation process better? Right? And if we start to ask those questions, I think it'll become very clear, because the ROI is out there, that diverse teams make for more and better innovation and decisions. So that's my kind of stand on this: retention, intention, and selection. And we need to figure out how to do that selection piece a lot better.
Definitely. And if I can jump in, I definitely 100%. I think it's so important, even for myself as being somebody from software and hardware background, I saw how fast all of this types of skills were being automated. And so we're also if we look forward to where these skills going, a lot of the current coding requirements are going to be automated, and we're starting to see that, which means, to Jill's point, that emotional intelligence, how do you even assess for that or teach that or encourage that, and that making sure that we are helping recruit not just team members who are providing different opportunities to see different blind spots, but it is, to that point, how are we working together as a team? I think you also, another point that I wanted to stress that Jill shared is the access to the new markets. I think that there is an opportunity. That's where I put myself in my shoes, where I take a look at my Latinx community across the U.S. I mean, that's the demographic that's growing the fastest in the U.S. And a lot of the new companies are starting to come to, like, let's start selling to more to this community. The reality is, if the product doesn't reflect the cultural values that attract us to it, we're going to go to somebody else. And we're starting to see that with more startup founders starting to actually create companies that are leveraging the technologies, but much with a cultural appeal. And I think that that's going to be a difference as well as technology continues to advance. What is a differentiator? And I definitely believe that it starts with ultimately, like how they say in the Valley, how software eats hardware. Well, I say culture eats software.
Beautifully quoted, really. Again, this is amazingly articulated. I love, Jill, what you said about like just the three components. I love how you framed it up. And again, Lily, completely agree. I want to also address what Karen said about if we don't fix the problem at its core, we end up building technology, which is just amplifying the issues we already see. And we've already seen that, right? There are tech companies, we will not name names, but tech companies who come up with hiring technology, for example, and they end up hiring just more white people because that's what they've always traditionally done. So that's also introduced, that bias is introduced into the systems they're creating. But to Lily, your point, when you have the cultural piece component and the diversity part covered, so you can avoid those blind spots. So love everything that you've just shared. That's spot on. So I feel like we are busting a lot of the myths that are out there. Why we are so far away from gender equality. So here's another one that I get a lot because I host panels on a regular basis and I'm recruiting folks. And I always go with a women first approach, minority first approach when I put together a panel like this as well. And I've always found that folks have this misconception in their head that when we recruit for diversity, whether it's on a panel like this or whether we recruit for jobs, that we are somehow compromising quality. And that comes up a lot, saying that, oh, I would love to have diversity, but that we would have to give up on the quality of people that we are recruiting or hiring. You kind of alluded to that in what you've shared so far. Could you like talk to, if somebody comes up to you and says that, like, what is your response? Like, how would you frame that response?
Well, I'll start off because I think asking better questions, you're going to get rid of that, right? Because if we ask better questions, you realize we're not lowering bar, we're raising the bar, right? We're literally saying, not only do you have to have the skills, but you need to bring in these additional value to the company, right? And so that's sort of my first response. But then there's another issue out there, which is that when women tend to be very accurate in describing their skills and accomplishment, and research shows that men are inclined to inflate their performance estimates, right? That the employers don't always take that into account. So they'll see what a guy says and they'll take it at face value, even though there's an equally competent, worse woman who's competing for that same job. And it's, I don't know why they call it, but they call it honest overconfidence. It's not being done intentionally or, to be deceptive. They just have been brought up that way, whereas many times women are brought up to be more humble and be more conservative in what they say. But when the other part of this is if women do take on that role of being overconfident, which I'm not sure we want to teach people to be more overconfident, right? Like, I don't see the value there. But if we were to say, let's get women to exaggerate their skills just as men overinflate their skills so that we can have an apples to apples comparison, the problem is women get penalized if they do that, right? They're breaking a social norm. They're being not behaving like a woman. And so where men don't get penalized, in fact, they get advantages and they get promoted, women get penalized. And I'm going to go out there on the political limb and say, that's what happened with Elizabeth Warren, right? So Elizabeth Warren, unapologetic, super competent, she says, unapologetically and unavoidably credentialed, right? Like she had amazing skills, and she went out on the campaign trail to do what they're required to do as candidates, and that's to sing your own praises. And when she did that, she was treated as she was condescending or a know-it-all. And it's this dichotomy and this unfair treatment that women receive, not just from the media, but from people, men and women, right? This unconscious bias that is causing people to be evaluated differently. And there's this perception you're lowering the bar, but you're not, right? So that's my little soapbox.
So I think it's really important. I give a whole other speech or set of speeches on equality. We're really talking about quality, not equality, because when you start thinking about this broader definition of what quality means and what characteristics we're really looking for and what we're recruiting and selecting for, Jill, I think you're exactly right. I think the core problem falls away. The data would bear us out that corporations that have women on boards they're not just less risk averse, but they actually perform better. And the reason they perform better is they're not subject to some of the cognitive blind spots, particularly in risk analysis, which is a board's function, that companies that are more unitary in their demographic or outlook. And I see the same thing in teams, right? And I see you can start to point out to people where diversity is already helping them. And so, for instance, it's generational diversity and problem solving. And you can start to look for instances where the lack of diversity is creating more fragile environments or less robust environments than they may want, and start to connect that to gender. And we see that a little bit, but it is not widely appreciated. And I think this equality argument, frankly, is laziness and kind of a fallback to, there's 4 reasons we can't do this. And job number 1 is always, hiring the best people. I honestly, I think that's to any serious critic of the current environment, it just rings very hollow. I think we've already demonstrated that quality really isn't the problem. It's access to opportunity, it's access to capital, it's access to promotion, it's the access to environments where you feel you've got permission structures to succeed. It's all of that, but that has nothing to do with quality. I mean, that if anything, I think there's pressure now, and it's coming, I see it coming from the investor community that says that if you don't have diversity on your board, I'm not going to invest in your company. That you are lacking robustness that I want to see as an investor. And you need to start seeing, I think, more demand for those characteristics get pulled through the system and by men. It's got to be men saying, I don't want to see gender, the lack of gender parity. I want to see some other reality, and those are allies we need, frankly, in this world. And I think we're starting to see it, but I'm also starting to see that the quality argument is sort of fading because it's been so disproven and so discredited. So I'm not saying it's over, but I'm not. That seems like an easier one to respond to these days than it did maybe even 5 or 10 years ago.
And just to add, I think for Man to take the dialogue forward as well, and the equity side, where I think, especially just seen from the work that I've done locally, where unfortunately when you look at zip codes by zip codes, the funding for schooling, the post-secondary training, the job opportunities varies, and a lot of it hasn't been by accident. It's actually been by design. And so we are aware of those red districting, the redlining, and those types of policy aspects that have don't come even from the tech sector, but just in general from the history of this nation, right? And so we have to address that in making sure that we are addressing in some of the root cause and systemic issues, because if we just think that it is one sector, it's a band-aid of a band-aid. We're optimizing one sector, but we're not really addressing the larger issues. However, I think that with more information now, being able to assess talent in their distance traveled, which is something that we use at the center, of identifying where did somebody start, what did they overcome, what are those resilience skills, and that sometimes you only learn by doing, and whether that person had equitable access to, say, computer science in high school, maybe they didn't, they had to go to a local nonprofit to gain those skills, but yeah, you know what, they were able to have the hands-on experience. Is that project the same worth as a class? who's being able to assess the different types of ways that the new talent is being able to gain that knowledge that maybe it doesn't fit the ways some of these tech companies are assessing them. And so I think that there is a discussion about equity, distance traveled, but also I think that there's also this, to me, I'm passionate about it because I have lived the journey of what it's like to be in the lab coding, and it seemed so scary when I first started. And the reality though is like when you think about when there's the largest opportunity of wealth creation, new wealth creation through technology in this generation, it came through tech. Wouldn't you want to keep it a good secret? Wouldn't you want to be able to manipulate sometimes even the pay with less competition? Well, the reality is that the getting into like learning how to code is not really that hard if you have the opportunity and the access. But we know that there's systemic issues such as digital divide, having the right curriculum, having the right structure, being able to also have the hands-on learning experience and the evaluation. But there is a lot of new folks that are being able to gain these skills and be able to actually launch their own companies. But then when we start getting into the next funding level, as Karen mentioned, that's where there's the big gap. So we have talent that is amazing, women of color, founders, tech companies, but yet they're also facing getting stuck on that side of the field as well. And so I think it is a systemic. It's about equity. It's about access. But I'm very optimistic in being able to have dialogues like this where we're able to share resources, where we can continue to amplify each other's voices, to be able to show that there is change happening. And maybe, you know what, it'll take a group of women in this room to start funding the next companies that we want to be able to see that will be closing these divides.
Amen to that, definitely. I love that you mentioned equity because we can't really have any discussion about equality without equity, because that gets lost, because how can you even strive for equality when you don't have access to the same opportunities? So there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done at very systemic, a societal level. So totally agree. So let's talk about, we're going into this fourth industrial revolution. We are already there. We're talking about technology. AI is everywhere, right? Like not one day goes by, like you have headlines over headlines for how companies are utilizing it. And we are doing it at a time all these societal and systemic issues have not yet been solved. And there have been studies that show that women, minorities are going to be most impacted by these technologies as they get rolled out. So my question was, what are your thoughts about how technologies like AI, especially AI, how it might impact inequality that we're already seeing in the society? Anyone wants to go first? How about you? Karen?
Sure. I mean, I think from a today perspective, you're looking at things like at hiring, like we've talked about, and sort of the over automation or the sort of the rigidity that's in some of the automation right now around hiring tools and who's programming them and so forth. You're also talking about access to like lending opportunities. There's the big story about, you know, the Apple Card came out and the terms of the available terms for women were less favorable than they were for the men, and that was sort of quickly addressed and all of that, but sort of horrifying that could get out the door in the first instance. So I think we're seeing it a little bit in that way. I'm actually less from a broader future of work perspective. I actually am less worried. I think men and women may be affected differently, but I don't know that they will be affected any less, in the sense that a lot of jobs that are traditionally male, like, you know, drivers and things like that, are going to be automated as quickly or more quickly than jobs like nursing, where women are more still more prevalent in the workforce. So I think it's going to be differently. I think women are going to have to become savvy about AI very quickly, because it's, you know, if they remain the primary caretakers of children and educators, you know, how AI interacts with children and in educational settings and in sort of just managing the digital home. I think women are actually going to have to become very sophisticated very quickly about the kinds of tools they're bringing into the house and how those are being used with and for their families. So there's an opportunity there actually to involve and engage women in discussion in a very practical way around AI and what AI is really doing from a consumer's perspective. That doesn't have to be a gendered conversation, but I think as a practical matter, aspects of it will be. So I have a slightly different lens on the question or the problem as you've presented it. Surely someone else has a view.
I think it's undeniable, you know, the impacts that this specific technology has, which I think it's still at its nascent state as far as development, and which is a good thing, because maybe we have the opportunity now, knowing what we know, how can we actually create a much more equitable representation of the talent that's really conceptualizing, designing, evaluating, creating, and putting this stuff, these technologies out. What I would love to see is to be able to see not just the techies. I want to see folks like Karen. I want to see educators. I want to see social workers. I want to see creatives having this dialogue. So then that way we could actually take a look at what is it that we're trying to solve and build, and why. I think one of the things that I've just in my past experience from being somebody making software to also being a consultant at different companies like Booz and Accenture, where I was working with Fortune 500 clients and federal clients, the question was always like, what, just because we can build it, should we build it? And just because we can scale it, should we scale it? Is scale really where we need to go, or are some things necessary to actually be slowed down? And I think that specifically now, the need for standards, the need for transparency, the need for more participation from our community in the design, in the conceptualization is important. And I'm going off in my whole tech ethics buzz right now because I've been taking a course through Stanford, CS, Public Policy, and also their ethics department together, which is really bringing tech workers as well as folks like myself from a different lens, and having these dialogues and having the discussion of like, should we build it or not? And I think that's a lot of the times where we need to have these different voices really have the positioning and help us make that decision together. Without that, we're always going to miss some of the use cases of people like my family, right? The stats show that the automation that's going to be coming will unlock new jobs and will unlock new opportunities, but it's also going to displace people in a lot of the service jobs. And the data shows that unfortunately, most of those is overrepresented in the Latinx population. And so according to the McKinsey Global Institute report, it says that 1 out of 4 Latinx workers in the US is going to be displaced. So that's my aunt, that could be cousins, that could be different family members. And so in my head, it's like, where's the investment in the upskilling? How are we continuously showing opportunities? Okay, you start at, let's say, at your first job, but what is the next level of continuing to learn? Who's investing? And if we take a look at what the point that Jill made earlier, if you're already inside this tech company and you're being retained, you're going to have the opportunity for the next level of upskilling, because these companies are investing actually more in that area. But if you don't even get the chance to get in, or you leave and they're not thinking about retention, that's going to create a bigger gap, I think, in the discrepancy and the lack of representation. So I think it's a twofold. One is overall, how is this technology impacting everyday community members, whether they're in tech or not? And then also, what is the discrepancy or the gap that's going to continue to grow for the people who are already inside these tech companies, who are getting the investment to continue to learn, while folks who are caught in between are going to get left behind at different numbers. But again, my optimistic side comes in. I believe in different organizations, startups, and if we all come in as ecosystem builders, we can really address this. And I cannot stress the fact that we need to have more of these public policy discussions. We need our local governments to be part of this. There's a lot of jobs. I'll give you an example. You've seen probably the Port of Oakland being in the news because there's something, there is the cruise ship that's going to be there. But Port of Oakland in itself, when I did a study about 2-3 years ago, they were actually looking for more entry-level jobs and good paying jobs here in Oakland, but they weren't able to get the right talent. And so they actually were at the pace that they needed, and they've been forced to actually automate more than they anticipated. And so we're now caught in this cross point where it's how are we also working as an ecosystem to be able to connect these dots of talent and employment while we are in this transition, while we're also moving towards new technologies?
Yeah, I love this question because it really is about all of these very interesting intersections, right? So, when Karen's talking about, which jobs are being displaced and how are they being displaced, globally, it does look like women are going to be disproportionately impacted, but it depends on the country, it depends on the place. And then, to Lily's point, like this idea of being able to, understand the development and the development teams. Like this was at a conference I was at recently where the speaker said, if you're gonna develop for them, make sure there's some theys in the room when you're doing it. And so, this idea of like, we really need everybody at the table, and then connecting that dot, as you did with Lily, to this future of work. And what is the training and upskilling opportunities? But in terms of like, I think the part that concerns me the most is the lack of sort of regulation, ethics, and a foundation for making sure that things are equitable. And the best example of this, and Karen, you kind of touched on this, is in hiring. So I don't know how much of our audience is aware of how much AI there is in the human resources train, how much basically AI is going to determine who sees the job ad in the first place. It's going to decide who makes it through the job filter. It might even decide who has the personality through a video. It might have your skills tested through a game. And then it continues even after you've been hired. It's predicting your performance and your salary and different things like that. And so people need to understand how much it's already happening, right? And then when you understand that, you can start to ask the questions that are really important, which is, what do we know about the training data sets? Are they all based on men who were in the career before? What are the proxies that they're using? And are those good proxies? Are those bad proxies? And what is the machine learning on its own? Because it's designed to see patterns. And so it could see patterns that you're trying to anonymize out, but it'll find other ways of doing it. And so if that's the case, how do we know that bias is occurring? Because a lot of the AI is a black box, right? It's not transparent. We don't know what the proxies are. We don't know what the algorithms are doing. It's not audited. It's not checked. And there's no public oversight on it. And so the potential to amplify bias rather than end it is huge, right? And the other movement, which is really important, is explainable AI, right? Because right now, you could literally not know what part of the code is doing what. And how are you going to debug something? How are you going to remove bias if you don't even know where that is happening in the code? And so you lose transparency, you lose the ability to debug. So just looking at this little tiny example of HR and AI, it's really determining the future of employment for women and everybody, right? And so if we don't really start to dig in and ask the tough questions right now, we're going to see problems like we had before, which is Google shows only high-paying jobs to men, or the Facebook's ad algorithm discriminates by gender and race, or Amazon's hiring tools immediately started discriminating against women. Now we're learning, and we got to be public about these things, and we have to talk about the problems and not penalize people for talking about the problems, because we need to learn and discover from these things. So it's a big opportunity, and just taking that little tiny case of HR really gives you a view into the questions you have to ask, like Lily suggested, like who's being helped, who's being hurt, right? What are the unintended consequences? There's a lot of things that we need to train people around.
Yeah, and I want to add just one. I mean, there's so much there, Jill, but there's this whole, within the engineering community, I hear over and over again, well, we'll just, human in the loop, right? We'll have the results supervised, and, humans will decide whether that was a good outcome or a bad outcome. And that's not going to work, right? I mean, just for a whole bunch of reasons that are sort of obvious to the technology, that's not going to work. You need humans at every aspect. You need them in design, you need them in the data. I mean, you just need them at every stage, evaluating also how it gets implemented. But one of the things that I worry about is not, right now, there's lots of reasons to worry that the technology itself is, because it's so nascent, because we're still learning, it's not functioning quite right yet. I mean, so we're very worried about just the like poor quality AI, right? Something that we would define as poor quality as opposed to what it will ultimately be like once we've worked out some of the bugs. I worry equally, if not more, about what's going to happen when the AI is working just fine. but it's producing results that are in conflict with a human rights objective or imperative, or with a non-biased or non-discrimination policy imperative. So we need to be working with businesses, and this is why I'm making the switch I'm making, is working with businesses as they decide now how they're really going to, not just from a process perspective, but how they're really going to, from a boundaries perspective, expect these tools and the teams, the human teams that work with these tools, to use them. And you really, I don't think, can have a responsible use of these technologies without focusing both on the human side and process, as well as the technologies or the innate characteristics of the technology. So I think in terms of responsible use, which is the sort of human process stuff that we're sort of used to, and the trustworthy technology piece, which is really what is the innate characteristic and quality of the tool you're using. And if you're a non-technology company that's importing these HR tools, you don't have internal resources to really think through all this stuff necessarily. And the salespeople for these tools don't necessarily understand them well enough to reveal that. If you were to ask them the right questions, it's hard to know whether you'd understand the answers. So there's a real gap right now between the technical community and the non-technical community in terms of the impact and where they need to apply themselves. And that, I really think, when you look at the future of work and when you look at the complexity of these tools, we really need to be thinking in terms of integrated teams, so that these non-technical and technical people can, if not just be in dialogue, but be forming policy together. So now
can we actually trust, the companies themselves to establish these guidelines, right? Because, with the HR and hiring, it's kind of the wild, wild west right now. The students who are graduating are kind of the guinea pigs for this technology. And the only legal document that I know of is the Illinois Artificial Intelligence Video Act, which basically said, people have to give consent. They have to understand how it works. Only the people who are reviewing the videos get to review them, and people have the right to ask for it to be deleted. But it doesn't completely answer the questions, right? Because what if you don't want to participate in that process? Does that mean you just can't be hired, right? And so we need boundaries, we need guardrails.
Yeah, and the thing is, even once we have policy and regulation, we've got some policies out there, like over 100 AI policies that you could download today and start thinking about. But how a particular business implements it in a particular setting with a particular technology, for a particular purpose, is still going to be very unclear, because these regulations are going to be articulated fairly aspirationally. And even like you say, even the Illinois law doesn't really get at the root of the bias problem. It gets at root, it's a data policy legislation, right? That just says that you have a right to that data being deleted or confined in how it is reviewed and stored. It has nothing to do with the quality of the technology to begin with.
What I would add to this discussion is that there's a sense of urgency, because to the point of, like, what if these things are working as they should, but when it's somebody's life on the line, there are, for example, we already have seen some of the cases impacting Black women in hospitals being treated much more unfairly through what the systems were working right. And for I forget the actual name of the company, but specifically like in healthcare, right? I think that there's some of these technologies. To me, it's important to have this dialogue and ethics and transparency, and being able to also apply the right policy, because when we get to the level where it gets applied on a large scale, such as across healthcare, or whether somebody can get loans through finance opportunities or education, where a lot of the times we're dealing with people's lives being on the line. And a lot of these types of software has been getting actually used inside criminal justice reform, to actually amplify or the problems that we already know exist. And so it's maybe an algorithm to somebody behind the screen, but it's somebody's life on the line. And I think that we all have the responsibility to make sure that we're raising the urgency and having the dialogue, because our own civil rights, it's on the line.
Very, very well put. Thank you so much for articulating it so well. It's not just about the technology. These are people's lives, whether it's incarceration rates, and whether it's a matter of, like, does somebody get healthcare versus not, and what kind of diagnosis and such. And so we have to move the conversation away from the technology and really focus on the human and how it affects their rights, how it affects is it helping inequality? It's making it like helping it and so on. I would like to just mention one thing. You talked about ethics, and I started a project 2 years back. I started mapping who is working on the ethics of AI. And I found that, shouldn't be that surprising, but it's women. There is like this amazingly hundreds of women around the globe who are working specifically on tackling the issue of ethics of AI. And one thing I would like to point out, what is very helpful and important about discussions like this, that you're surfacing a very complex issue, taking a complex issue, you're making it simpler for people to understand, because as Jill mentioned a few times, and I completely agree, it's about asking the right questions. Mm-hmm. But unless people know what questions to ask, we'll always be in this loop that we always are depending on tech companies to actually decide for us what is or isn't. So, so everything that you're sharing right now is so helpful in understanding like the issues and the situation and putting a human lens on it and how this actually impacts us, not just tomorrow, not 20 years from now, as Jill said, today, right now. And yeah, so this was excellent. Thank you. So can we move into a more positive side, because we let's look at what are some examples where you've seen AI has been used to further the cause of human rights, right? Because I've seen technologies and companies who have offered the technologies in war-stricken areas. They have been in war zones. They've been deployed for countries which are plagued with poverty. And there are some examples of AI for good, like out there. So would you like to share from your experience, like where you're seeing the most impact, specifically around like, how is it helping address some of the issues that we just discussed?
Well, I can jump in because I'm going to start with a very narrow lens, and then we'll go to the bigger human rights issues with the rest of the panelists. Taking, again, this very small and specific and concrete example of hiring, right? If we look at it, bias exists very much in the recruiting process in the real world. People are using your name and your address to make snap judgments, which university you went to. And so a lot of problems exist in the real world. So the opportunity for AI to actually solve some of these problems is very much there. The potential is very much there. And so just to give a couple of examples, Textio looks for gendered language in resumes or in job descriptions and helps you rewrite them so you can write more fair and inclusive job descriptions. HireVue has taken the video aspect and made it a structured interview experience, because if you don't have structured interview experience, people have different leading questions. They're put on the defensive, different things happen. And we know that structured interviews work really well. So if everybody has the same interview experience and the same questions, which a automated system can do, that's more fair. Similarly, you can look at who's walking the talk in terms of being transparent about data. And I feel like Hired.com has this page where you can see who are all their employees. You can look at them segmented by different intersectionalities. You can look at them by different roles that they have in the company. And so we have some really good role models of companies that are using AI and being explicit, and then also following their own path, right? Like doing the things that they recommend others do. And then there's even, you know, virtual reality to train people in empathy and understanding a lot of these diversity issues. So there's absolutely no question that AI has the potential to really kind of level the playing field and be more inclusive as well. We just need to make sure we do it well.
I agree with that. I also think the work that's being done on like micro, loans and the ability to distribute capital is something that AI has been very around the world to underserved communities. Likewise with healthcare and education. I mean, I think the opportunities there are spectacular. And already you're seeing that being used, and just even in the last couple of weeks, if you start looking for it, you'll start to see that there are a lot of AI tools that have been trained on COVID-19 to try to figure out how can we sort of more quickly and more with more efficacy get meaningful therapies or diagnostics out and distributed. So I mean, I think we're going to start to see, if you start looking for AI, you'll see it kind of everywhere. But it's for the force of good, it's unlimited. If we just have to kind of make sure we're looking at the whole picture.
It actually reminds me of a site called iris.ai, and it uses artificial intelligence to help people surface research that's related to their topic without them having to know the exact terminology. So it can really advance how people do research as well.
Definitely. I think that's the education side. I think it's so huge. So I'm a proud advisory board member of AI for All, that is really looking at demystifying what even the language that gets used. What does AI actually mean, and what are the differences, and how could it actually be start to get taught? And so just to put it as a resource, AI for All launched in October the Open Learning Program, which is a free project-based AI education program that's facilitated by community members, so others teaching others to get this a basic understanding, but then to also be able to build and apply it in different issues that they have. So I'm really excited about the opportunity that when we start to democratize the access, but also get past some of these what we call the verbiage that maybe it makes it harder to understand, but being able to show how this can be something for good, I think it will be important. And I'm very supportive of organizations like AI for All continuing to look at and providing these tools in an open data format in a way that's accessible to more people across the globe as well. And I think it's also the other part too that that to me it's interesting, and I go back to some of these students in middle school and high school right now. Like, they've been able to grow up with the tip of their finger, if they have access to computer and Wi-Fi, so much information that even I didn't get to grow up with. And again, at the AI for All, they've served over 500 plus students, and some of the middle school students. One of the big memories that I have was at the center. We hosted, one of the alumni hosted a workshop for local middle school girls of color, brought the laptops, about everything. They were able to design through a very step-by-step web interface, things that problems that they were seeing in their community, and having them actually take a stab at the first step and being able to get introduced was just really inspiring. And to now see some of those alumni be able to get awards at the level of some of PhD students in some of these topics is really interesting, because they're asking different questions. They're asking in a way, to Jill's point at the beginning, they're asking just different nuance, different use cases that with their lived experience, with what they're learning or seeing, we're really starting to get into different topics that other groups aren't asking. So I'm really, really interested in what that would lead to, and how we can continue to ask the right questions, and the technology in itself would follow in itself. But if we don't start with solving the right problems, then I think we'll just end up replicating some of the past issues that we have in this specific space. I would also I think in the from a tech industry perspective, and Jill brought up a great point that all these different tools, it's such a growing sector now. There's so much happening. But yet I think something as simple as anonymizing the interview process, the standardization, is something that hopefully will become more mainstream and adopted. Interviewing.io is a Caper Capital company that really masks that, and it's been able to allow folks, without even knowing who's on the other side or anything part of their identity, to be able to go through the technical interview process in a standard format. So I hope to see more of these types of technologies being able to apply and be able to get utilized at a larger scale.
Amen. Let's see. So you all work with organizations which are unique in their approach, because this is, again, let's face it, we talked about it, and we could go days talking about it. It is a complex issue. So when we talk about inequality, there are different approaches. There's multi-layer challenges. Can you just share in a few, briefly, what is your organization's approach to solving this problem? Like, which specific area are you focused on, just solving this issue of inequality?
I can jump right in and just do a quick one at the Caper Center, because we actually look at the entire leaky tech pipeline, everything from K through 12 to post-secondary to tech workforce, and all the way to venture capital and entrepreneurship. So it really is about a systemic lens to tackle the systemic barriers. But we have the opportunity through the different focus areas, specifically SMASH, looking at a 3-year program to help advance STEM programming and skills to high school students. So then that way they can persevere through college and as well, or whatever schooling and enter the workforce. Within, we have the foundation side that does amazing research. We have diversity advocates that's really working within the companies themselves. And then we're also working with the ERG leaders, the employee resource groups, through our collective, all the way to going to investing in companies that are creating technology that's closing gaps of access through the Caper Capital side of the house. And so I think being able to see all these different pieces come together really provides us a different insight, because our lens is also leading with racial justice and economic justice. And so for me, it's really important to be able to join these spaces and be able to share out those resources, the data, but also bring awareness to the intersectionality, and that's really needed for some of these systemic changes that we need.
Yeah, I would add to that, you know, research and data is very important, right? Because it empowers us to have a conversation with a stronger footing and to overcome a lot of objections or people's disbelief. Let's call it that, their disbelief that there's a problem there. And so the Women in Tech initiative, we kind of look at how can we support the research and data for the different types of knowledge that we need in terms of what is the current state of women in tech, what are the best practices. So that's sort of one area we focus on. And then we want to actually transition that into the real world. So we work with, you know, executives from different tech companies and provide a space, a safe space for them to talk amongst themselves and have peer-to-peer conversations about how do these things work? How do we do salary equity surveys? What's that like when you're actually trying to implement it in a complex organization? And so that's one key thing, is to help them make better decisions and work on their companies, and to the extent that academic and corporate cooperation can help that move forward. And then we want to help with the on-ramps, right? Creating more on-ramps into technology for underrepresented people, being more intentional about how we reach out, I think is really key. And I think sort of overarching all of this is this question of how do we change how leadership is taught? Right? How do we make sure ethics is part of the computer science engineering curriculum? How do we make sure that people have design thinking and empathy when they're, and know, to your point, Lily, to ask the right questions, right? And so I think being at a university, we have that both opportunity and obligation, which we really focus on.
So, and from my perspective, I mean, it's a little, I mean, we think about it obviously in different ways at the law firm. In the new job, I'll be working very much with companies as they think through specific use cases and the kinds of guardrails and risk, frankly, risk mitigation and risk oversight that they want to deploy, because I think understanding that there's business continuity risk, reputational risk, legal risk, they're going to need to put boundaries around these technologies, and sort of helping them work through that this is going to be part of that work. And then I'm also on the board of an organization called the American AI Forum, and we're very focused on K through 12 education, primarily from the non-technical, right? So teaching kids not on the coasts necessarily what they need to know to think about what, you know, class curriculum, what they need to think about as consumers, what they need to think about job selection and sort of training. So really, again, all of this is around bridging the technical and non-technical communities so that we're having a more rich discussion around the human rights piece, and also just the risk mitigation piece. So,
Karen, what's the website for that?
The American AI Forum?
Yeah.
Still stealth, but I'll get that out to everybody, but we're about to launch it. We're in our beta right now in Akron, Ohio, and it's been wildly successful, actually. So
outstanding. That sounds exciting.
It certainly does. Very exciting. So we will just have, so just having this conversation and hearing your perspective just gives me a lot of hope. I just wanted to share that. There's a lot of cause for optimism here. I wanted to just wrap up with two questions. One is, can you suggest a person or a book or a resource that you have been personally influenced by, personally and professionally, and you would recommend that everyone else also take a look at it, that you would advise for others?
My absolute favorite, Invisible Women. If you haven't read it, find it, prepare yourself for it. It's an amazing deep dive into how the world's really designed for men as the standard human, and what that means for every aspect of our lives. So Invisible Women is great. And then right in the same boat, Weapons of Math Destruction and Algorithms of Oppression. each one of them bring a really important lens to the conversation, and Algorithms of Oppression, really pointedly brings out that things like Google that you assume to be a social good and serving everybody really aren't. And that as a for-profit company, there's a lot of problems in their algorithms, and everybody tries to say it's not our fault, it's the algorithm, but they can actually fix these things if they're asked. So we need to be informed and then go champion the equality.
I think for myself, one of the books is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for Human Future, The New Frontier of Power by Shoshana Zuboff. It is an amazing, amazing deep dive just on really the motivations and the business models, and also how policy has trailed and all the different politics. Is just really an amazing deep dive to help us understand what is the environment that we're operating with. And this is why I go back to, like, what are we building for? And if we start to take a look at it's that somebody's idea was like, oh, I just want to see what this could be in their dorm room, to where we're at now, where our democracy has been questioned, really shows, yes, a person can change the world, but without the right guardrails and discussions, are they changing it for the better or not? And whose world is it changing, and whose world is it being optimized for? So I highly, highly recommend that book. Also, I'm going to share in the chat the link to the tech ethics policy class that I shared about. It's all an open source. There's a really great blog. There's just so many good different readings that are also just really, really, really awesome. And some of the ones that were my favorite ones were about whether the AI specifically in the public sector, should it be done by private companies or by publics, and what is the type of talent that's needed, and the types of questionings and standards, and what are the pros and cons. So I'll share that link out. Just feel free to do a deep dive on that. There's just really great material there.
That's great. And our desks and bedside tables must look exactly the same, because it's the same library. So I'm actually taking a different direction to add to that. I think Steven Pinker's new works around sort of how much civilization is accomplished is really important. And it's basically in defense of the Enlightenment. And so anyway, so a different perspective on it. I've also thought that behave is I've got a personal rule that for every book I read about technology and what it's doing to us, I also read a book about neurobiology or neuropsychology. So because we're also learning a lot about how the human brain works, and it's really the interaction of these two things that's creating opportunity and a lot of risk also, including the Google kind of outcomes and the algorithm impacts. But because it's the way the human brain processes information. I'm very worried about deep fakes. It's because how we perceive things, right? So the more we learn about the human brain, the more interesting technology becomes, and vice versa. So the other book is Behave, and it's really a compendium of sort of what we know now about what acts on our brains in over long terms and in very short sort of nanosecond terms. So it's just an interesting perspective on us. So different, but I fully endorse the reading list that just came before me.
All great books. I host a Twitter chat on AI ethics, and a lot of these books are on our list. And so, yeah, always like adding new ones to that. And a lot of women have written these books. Might I add just one more to your list is Safiya Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, because she's done an amazing job just dissecting how search algorithms work. And even when we thought they were neutral, there's so much bias just built into the systems. So thank you so much for those recommendations. And somebody had asked if we can put those names in the chat window, and we'll try our best. And if you wouldn't mind also adding your recommendations in there, that'd be great.
Yeah, I would also say that we should add the one, there are a couple books around women and emotion and women and rage, and we should probably read those too. Just the normalization of women's experience and how it gets translated and mistranslated. So I'll put those up as well.
Thank you so much. Okay, so here's down to our last question. We are about at getting close to 3:30. So if there was one, we covered a lot of ground, and this was just the most amazing and comprehensive discussion we have had on the subject. what would be the one thing you'd like folks to take away from this session today? If it was just because human memory, right? We only can retain so much information. And if they were to walk away, it was one thing they shared with a friend and say, hey, I went to this great panel discussion and this is what I learned. What would that be?
I mean, I'll start and then we'll go back the other way. So for me, the thing I would want everybody to take away is that everybody has agency over the technologies that they use and how we master them. I think it's like learning to drive. Like nobody's born knowing how to do that, but we need to learn how to do that, which is an ironic, and anyway, setting aside autonomous self-driving cars. But we all need to learn how to do this as a skill, and we all have a role to play, whether we are technical people or non-technical people. And I would just take away that there's a ton of reason to be optimistic about all of this, but only if we participate. And if we are passive consumers, that optimism is not well placed.
I would add, we need diverse teams innovating AI and questioning the gold standards, but we also need to audit and hold these companies accountable. And what that means is if you're creating AI or algorithms, you need to be asking those important questions about unintended consequences and feedback loops and who's helped and who's hurt. If you're hiring a company that uses AI, you have to ask them, how diverse is your development team? What's in the algorithm? What are you using as proxies? We need explainable AI. We need testing. We need evidence and verification. And so we need to demand those. And then as individuals, what that translates to is we need to fight for transparency, consent, freedom from bias, feedback, redress, independent oversight, and governance, so that AI is truly engineered for all. Right? And I didn't make up that list. That was a crowdsourced group of AI experts who have created a Bill of Rights for AI. And it's so important that we're aware of these things, because if you're the victim of a bad AI and you have no redress or no way to get it fixed, we have a big problem. So we need to be able to, champion our own ability to demand these things.
100% love everything that's been said. I think for my end, it's really just keep showing up, keep learning, keep building, and then most importantly, making sure that we're exercising the right to vote at all different levels, the right to be part of policy creation, be part of how are we actually helping in a very practical way, everything from our own zip codes to a regional to state to also on a global lens. I think given the times that we're in, also the timing, we've seen how important it is to just keep showing up and take space. I think being able to have these types of dialogues like we've had today is super critical. So then that way people feel more empowered, specifically women feel more empowered to have these dialogues and keep questioning what's currently in place, and ultimately be able to together move towards recommendations and policy. Ultimately, I really, really would love to go and see more programs where it is coming, those stakeholders of diverse teams of skills, backgrounds, ages, thinking, life experience, not only in the tech companies, but in policy. I think being able to have a way that at a large scale, we're able to maintain opportunity and creation, regardless of where you started. I think it's a responsibility that we all have, and being able to be in a democratic country, I think that's something that I don't want us to also lose. So again, just keep taking space, owning your voice, building, showing up, and exercising the rights that we have as much as we can, and ultimately encouraging the next generation as well to continue the movement and the discussion into action.
Oh my gosh, I almost got goosebumps listening to these recaps. Thank you so much. So this would be the part in a live event, we would have a huge round of applause for you. So we'll just have to use our imagination, but I have to say this was such an incredible discussion. And from the bottom of my heart and from all my colleagues and the organization, I'd just like to say thank you for taking the time to share this, your words of wisdom, your insights, just your very practical, pragmatic approach, and also inspiring approach to how we can really tackle these problems. I mean, I couldn't imagine a better way to spend today of all days rather than be here and just listen to your just dropping all this wisdom. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, we'll switch into the Q&A. We're not done yet. I just wanted to pause for a second. I'll now take the audience questions. And one of them, I feel like just, it's a great one. I would have asked myself, and I'm glad somebody did. Okay, so thank you for the amazing discussion. Love hearing the systems level thinking and problem solving. And problem solving, how should grassroots movements work with top-down leadership and governmental approaches to shifting societal inequalities that are impacting the tech industry and many, many areas of our lives? Like basically, it's like, how can we, I love that you said vote, show up. I think that's all very critical. Are there some other practical ways that folks can actually influence some of these policies, like from a grassroots movements that they might be part of? Like, what do you recommend?
Sure, at least from my end, we actually work with a lot of local organizations and being able to be in rooms where, for example, for myself, where I go and I talk about tech and being able to share both the economic upward mobilities that it could provide, but also have this discussion where we need all the voices in the room, especially organizations that are working on developing the talent, whether it's upskilling into new paths. I think there's a huge opportunity, especially now, thanks to social media, to amplify the messaging and really unite and be able to ask those different questions that aren't being asked and hold these companies more responsible. Just for my own experience, when I first started at Caper Center, the way the grassroots organizations mobilized against Uber and questioning Uber when they were coming here, to the way they've also participated working with Square. It's a really different contrast of how the community is engaging, but also because on the other side of the companies, Square learned that you can't come into Oakland without really working with the community first, because the community here is very active and will ask the tough questions, will show up, and will continue the dialogue. So I think it's if anything, it's very important to continue, as regardless of what organization you are, showing up and mobilizing. Specifically here, I've seen it be so much powerful. And especially, I think for me, it's being also able to provide opportunities and invitations to those organizations to join some of these circles that sometimes we are not invited to. And so I would actually encourage other people who have access to take a guest with you or take the organization. So host a special session where you are bringing the different dialogues and having a true conversation that's also important.
I would add partnering with the academic institutions, obviously being from Berkeley. I'm aware of all the different research and graduate student projects that are going on, and they look for partners with grassroots organizations who have the trust and the relationships with the communities to get the data that they can then help to visualize and help to understand. Specific to AI, there's a citizen clinic that's run out of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity that works with certain segments of the population to make sure that they have equitable access to their own cybersecurity. We have a group called GEESE, which is a graduate student group. We have our Citrus Policy Lab, which is trying to address the gap between those who understand technology and those who understand policy. We need people who understand both and can really help to inform governments, help to inform politicians on how to establish legislation that will actually work in the face of these changing technologies. And that's similar. We have the Goldman School of Public Policy. We've got our data science division that does discovery projects. And so there's a lot of opportunities, I think, if you look at the nearby universities, and not just Berkeley, but community colleges and other places that will really partner with the grassroots organizations to help them take what they know and quantify it.
And I would just add that on a much smaller level, one thing you can do as an individual consumer, you can do this, and I think we've just discussed it, but as to the extent your organization is acquiring technologies or ingesting technologies, let alone whether you're developing them, it's really starting to ask the right questions about what is behind them and how do they function and who do they function for and what are the guardrails. So it's creating that dialogue and sort of a demand condition so that the products that get supplied to you are better. Same thing if you're an investor, demand that your money be invested where your values are. And if your values include diversity or responsible tech, applied tech, then get those answers and talk with your dollars as well as your feet.
Just to add one more to that, the ecosystem building, I think, is so important. And I'm starting to see a lot of coalition building, where different organizations are partnering up together in ways that they didn't before, and being able to have to your point, Karen, being able to bring in the funders with the folks who are doing direct service, but the public policy, really, it's that ecosystem that is really important. And especially, I think for my end, being able to give respect and able to give additional resources to these organizations that are subject matter experts that have been doing this work for so many years, in and out throughout. I think it's important for specifically, and this is if there's anybody from the tech sector, tech companies, to do your homework before you start going to any city. Really take a look at who's been doing this work and be respectful of them. Don't just try to jump in and give them the solution. There are a lot of different duplications and people who are trying to, quote unquote, say like, I'm going to go and do this. But there's organizations that would love your support and actually deserve their respect. And so I think approaching this type of work with humility is important. So then that way we could all come together and really leverage the time, the resources better.
That's great advice. Agreed. There was a question, and it's more on the policy side. And I'm curious, Jill, you had mentioned some policies and some laws that have been passed. One was related to the deep fakes. There's also been other policies, at least proposed legislation in front of Congress, and we don't know if it's ever going to be passed, but it's there. There's some momentum around it. Could you talk a little bit more about these policies and where are they in terms of actually making it to legislation? And are there any that we should keep an eye on, like related to just governance of these technologies?
Yeah, I'll speak more as a referral. My colleague, Brandy Noneke, heads up the Citrus Policy Lab. And the way that she has been engaging with government is very interesting. She tries to review legislation before it is proposed, right? To give expert input and advice. And then after things are proposed, also giving feedback. Would this work or would it not? Your conversation about deep fakes brings up, she actually had an opinion piece published in Wired magazine addressing why the legislation for deep fakes was going to fail for 3 reasons that she identified. And so I think, there is a huge gap here. And, one of the opportunities is to fill that gap, right? Is to identify how can we bring more people with tech expertise into the policy side, and to likewise from the policy side, get more people who have expertise in these areas, because this isn't going away. It's only going to get much, much larger. So I'll try to find a couple of links, and I'll put the link to the Citrus Policy Lab in as well, because they're a really great resource to follow. They actually have lists of research and data in this space that you can start. That's a good starting point, a good jumping off point.
That's great. We actually invited Brandy Noneke to a Twitter chat, and we met you through her, so very appreciate her a lot. And she did do a fantastic Twitter chat on just deepfakes, what we should know, why it's important, that like just dissecting it in a very meaningful way, because we have to acknowledge that not everybody is going to be an expert on the technologies. Like, how can we translate it into ways that makes sense to people who are not engineers, who are not technical folks, and just simplify it, because it impacts all of us. So that was very helpful. Karen, do you have anything to share? Because policy is really your area of expertise. Is there something you or Jill would like to add?
There's a lot of work being done at this point. A lot of it's coming out of Europe, where there's a sort of more coherent and consistent imperative over there. The UK likely will follow suit. So those of us in the applied policy area are looking very closely at what's coming out there. Again, still fairly aspirational, but a focus on transparency and explainability, 2 concepts I know we discussed earlier. And then there are a couple pieces of legislation that have been proposed in the US. I'm not especially optimistic that in an election year much is going to happen with those, but in the meantime, states will proceed forward with narrower concepts. So it's important to pay attention to that piece of it. The other piece of it that is going to start to emerge, which is wholly insufficient as a policy mechanism, is litigation. So you'll start to get reported outcomes in litigation around aspects of these problems. And the problem with that, of course, is that the litigation is pretty idiosyncratic, and it tends to solve for the corner case as opposed to the core initiative. But that's going to start to emerge, and that'll emerge in the U.S. where we have a fairly robust opportunity for that, and including also regulatory enforcement, like through the FTC and things like that. But you'll also start to see it coming out of other jurisdictions as well. So I think it's going to get pretty frothy pretty quickly. And again, as a practical matter, how these policies and litigation outcomes or whatever they are read onto your specific problem with the technology you want to use for the, in the context in which you're using it, is still it's very specific, very careful work that has to be done by every organization and every human. It's not going to be solved at a governmental level, short of just outright prohibitions, which I don't think we're going to get. So, my 2 cents.
Thank you. Lily, do you have anything to add before?
I think it's well said. I think the only thing that I just go back to the power of the community is making sure that we are bringing in all the different sectors to the table to have this dialogue and weigh in on these discussions. And that's where we're building the trust with community on the ground that's where these grassroots organizations are really important. And then being able to connect that dialogue, I think is really, really important. And going back, just humans, what are we trying to solve for, and for who, and how are we actually really improving each other's lives?
Fair enough. That's all. Thank you again for the great advice. And I feel the insights that you shared will help empower other women who are listening and other folks who can actually make a difference to speak up. Because I think often we make the mistake of thinking that we don't have the power, we don't have a voice, like what can one person do? And just being part of an organization, or just taking, just like you said, just showing up makes a lot of difference. So thank you so much for that encouragement and just very practical ideas as to how people can get involved. So that said, we do have a few questions, but they're not related to International Women's Day, and they're not not related to the topic at hand. So we will address those offline. So what I'd love to do, since we have only about 15 more minutes, I will First, I'd like to again thank you all so much for joining. I'd like to thank Google Women's Deckmaker, who also were our sponsors today, as well as the Canadian Consulate. Both of them have been very generous with the support. We hosted, UNSF hosted this event in partnership with the Legion, the American Legion, which is an association of veterans. We're very grateful for their support as well. So I'd love Mary to join us, Mary Steiner, the president, to help us just wrap up this event and let us know about, where do we go from here? So Mary, are you still online? Lovely.
Yes, hello, I guess I'm on.
Yes.
Hello?
You are, but we can't see you. You might want to turn on
let's see what happened here.
There you go.
Yes, I'm being asked to upgrade my, here we go. I'm being asked to upgrade as I'm doing it. So yes, I can't thank you all enough. And Mia and Jasmine are totally fearless as well, and undaunted when we had to really make a last minute decision and really scramble to make this happen online. And we are glad that you came together, because you've given us so many ideas about how we might collaborate and partner in our programming. We do provide these educational programs, and we'll be doing more online. Also, we provide mentoring, we provide speakers for other programs with other organizations. And we look forward to including you somehow in our global consultations, which we're doing. We're collecting narratives and looking at patterns of what people are thinking about the future of the UN and how it affects us here, and whether we're making any progress. A number of sectors will be invited, including tech and wealth, civil society, and government. I think our participants could fit into any of those sectors. We also include Indigenous people, youth, children, and so forth. So yes, we have a women's committee, and we're looking to implement CEDAW eventually nationally, at least in San Francisco. And all of the issues you've raised are issues that are related to the implementation of CEDAW. And how may we work further to advance the policies that were given us already, knowing that we are a global society. Our students are in a global classroom. There are no boundaries to what is happening with artificial intelligence and how it may be used for us or against us. All of the topics and all of the resources listed are phenomenal. And we've got, I think, a study group started now with Mia in charge. And again, Mia is fantastic. She is very modest. She's the author of 100 Women in AI, and we're thrilled to have her on our board. So again, we look forward to working with you, and we thank you for celebrating this very important day, knowing that the power of women is growing, and getting women involved in developing tech, leading tech is essential. We'll be looking forward to recognizing women who are making these achievements and providing them as mentors, and also providing support for women, knowing that there really is a great need for a safety net for women working in Silicon Valley, and especially supporting diversity. So again, thank you for joining us in this very exciting, pivotal time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mary. Thank you also for joining again. It was wonderful.
You're welcome. So we'll sign off now, but hopefully we'll sign in again soon. And thank you all for joining us out there.